This is Risk Reframed, the show where we bring you the leading risk experts from Moody's, our partners, and the wider ecosystem to discuss the risks organizations face, how they're interconnected, and ultimately what you, the risk professional, can do about them. So we're 4 years on, and the war in Ukraine continues. As recently as Davos, President Zelensky called out the fact that while sanctions are appreciated, enforcement needs to be there to make them effective. And so in 2026, what is happening with sanctions? I'm pleased to say we've got two of our most frequent and best guests with us today. We've got Datta and Hera Smith, two of our industry practice leads. How are you both, Ted?
Very well, Alex. Good to see you as always.
And Hera?
Good. Glad to be back.
Yeah. Thank you for making the trip. I know it's a short flight from Copenhagen, but it's still appreciated to come into the studio with all the cameras we now have.
Yeah. Anytime. Glad this time we both have our voices.
Yes. Yeah. We were a bit unlucky the last two, but we soldiered on, the professional that you are. So appreciate that. As I said just now in the intro, 4 years on, right, where this war still goes on, everyone's horror. What's sort of going on in sanctions in general? What's changed since we last did the 2025 sort of episode and the updates there?
Well, let's see. In 2025, there's been a fair amount of movement, especially in the EU. During the Danish presidency, there's been around 3 packages that have been pushed out. So I would say that there is definitely momentum still with regard to putting pressure on Russia and utilizing sanctions to change their behavior. With regard to enforcement, you mentioned Zelensky. I would say that there is, both on the US side and the European side, there is a push to kind of put more pressure, but through enforcement. Say, for example, in the US, they issued 14 enforcement actions for a total of $250-something million. In the UK, there's also been a number of enforcement actions that has come out as well. In the EU, there has been millions of dollars in fines and penalties that have been issued as well. Another interesting thing or angle in enforcement is that nowadays they're not just going after the money or fines, they're actually seizing vessels. Like, say, for example, in the case of France, the French government tracked and followed and seized a Russian shadow fleet. The US did something similar not too long ago as well. So I would say that enforcement has been a bit more aggressive in 2025.
Okay, so a lot going on, which is good news, I think. Overall, don't just want to see the headlines, you want to see action, right, for things to be effective. Is there a difference in how this applies to industries? I mean, Ted, have you got a perspective from your view working across so many things at Moody's?
Yeah, I would think that, three big kind of picture themes, if I look at a bigger retrospective since the 4-year period. So the first one is this whole evasion network circumvention as a standard approach. So, prior to Russia invading Ukraine, we were talking specifically more about the screening and the lists and prohibiting dealings and direct relationships. Now there is an expectation that you understand the network, the risk that comes with that, the potential for circumvention. And for corporates, that's probably a bigger problem because of the second theme, which is from knowing your counterparty to knowing the entire trade, the entire value chain, the entire life cycle of the product. It's corporates that are generally the big industrial manufacturers where they have components and supply chains that are more complex. So putting more pressure on that export control function to know that multi-tier or understand the origin of a particular good and then where it's going downstream. So that is probably a bigger area of rigor and research right now. And it's the large corporations that are straight in the crosshairs for that. So those teams, export control teams, have really been upping their game in the last couple of years and, ongoing in terms of understanding that.
That feels like a big change. It feels like over the last few years, we've talked about everything, but FIs have generally been front and center, right? Where we've talked about the need for different types of list screen and different data sets. Sanctions obviously historically has been most mature or most complex in banks and non-bank FIs. But corporates have always had to do some, but it just sounds like a totally different level to anything they've done previously. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say so. It seems like there is a shift of focus from following the money to actually looking at the goods, the whole supply chain. There is an expectation on firms now to look at indirect ownership and the whole supply chain level exposure and not just screen names on a list.
Okay. And for the public sector, has this changed a lot? Obviously, they're the ones broadly, if you think about the public sector as everything non-business, they're creating the sanctions, they're issuing them, they're enforcing them, etc. Like, so it's quite a wide gamut of different groups of people in that and different teams, but big changes for them as well as to how they think about all their roles.
I suppose when you think about any kind of supervision and enforcement, there's a general leveling of the skill set. There's a general increase in what's expected as reasonable, which is the kind of test in terms of mitigation. So as more open source intelligence, as more supply chain multi-tier tools come into the marketplace, as there's a greater expectation on what normal is, public sector enforcement agencies are sort of following that and then applying those enforcement mechanisms. So that's part of their skill set, is realizing what is expected, what is adequate, what is reasonable. Is that in the public domain? Did you know about that? And therefore, were your controls inadequate because you didn't have that kind of standard mitigation? So again, as more innovations hit the sanctions enforcement space, there are more technology options. There's more use of artificial intelligence, both as an enforcement agent, as a supervisor, and as a partner. So that's probably a big theme, is public sector awareness of what good looks like.
I suppose also of the AI use we're talking about, also the sanction parties will be trying to use it as well, I imagine, to get around and evade. So you kind of have what's happening in the world. You then have maybe technology and processes trying to capture it, regulation bringing up the floor of that. Then the enforcement lags that naturally because there has to be a period of implementation. And then you kind of go again, because once things kind of get sealed off to an extent, new type of sanctions evasion would happen, and therefore new technology innovation. Then the regulatory floor comes up again. So it feels like it's that constantly moving target.
I would say, though, that there is also a trend. There's a trend of using technology to evade sanctions, but there is also a trend of going back to the basics, using analog ways of getting around it. Say, for example, just using a correction fluid to change the details on a page.
Wow.
Or just painting over the IMO numbers on a ship. That's a more analog way. You don't need fancy technology to evade sanctions. And some of them are doing just that because it's fairly easy in some ways and more cost effective, so to speak. But just to circle back on the public sector and what changes have happened, I see more alignment between the US and the UK, specifically in the area of sanctions and sanctions enforcement. So say, for example, in the UK, OFSI, they have moved to a single list instead of a couple of lists of sanctioned entities. That is very similar to the US consolidated list. Another one they launched recently is the search tool, which is very similar to the OFAC search tool. If you go to the OFAC website, you can search a name in there and then they'll tell you whether or not it's on the list based on the level of fuzzy matching that you want. The UK has adopted something similar as well. So I think there's greater alignment between those two countries.
Okay, that's really interesting, I suppose. There's the political side of that, but potentially a good thing given how much trade and business goes back between the sort of Anglo-American axis. Is that your perspective as well, or is there any downsides to this that I'm maybe missing?
I think it's good to get alignment. The UK sanctions agencies are fairly new, so it's good to get knowledge and experience of the US OFAC agencies over and kind of adopt the best practices. On my end, I think that it would be good for the EU to do the same, but it's just quite fragmented because there's so many member states and each one has their own sanctions enforcement agency. So it's a little bit trickier to do that from an EU perspective.
Yeah. Just had a bit of color. In October, we had the US designations of Rosneft and Lukoil, just two of the largest Russian gas producers. And that was in alignment with the UK, with the EU. That hadn't been listed in the US at that point. Okay. And the size of their ownership networks is worth thinking about. Hera and I were chatting before, I think it's Rosneft, 500 subsidiaries. So the ownership and direct control there is significant. And when they were listed, some of the subsidiaries were listed with them. So increasingly we see OFAC listing with the network and the extended ownership and control. But that's probably, again, part of that alignment is they were a bit of an outlier in that context.
I'm assuming then the directors, the shareholder implications, or the people that would be, or other pieces that you'd need to be aware of that could end up one company with the associations being bigger than certain other countries' lists in entirety. Is that I mean, I haven't done the math, but in my head it would end
for
up
sure.
there. Yeah.
Yes. The number of entities that are sanctioned by extension in the US is much larger than the EU list of sanctions or the UK list of sanctions.
Right. Let's talk a little bit more about that corporation piece. So I believe the term is trade sanctions. Is that right? And you talked about export control. And can you talk a little bit more about how that differs and the specifics of how it differs to what people might be familiar with in just pure sanction list screening and taking the OFAC consolidated list and a few others and putting the names through? This seems like quite a different thing. So Hera, maybe if you can break it down for us, and Ted, love you to chime in.
Sure. So let's see. Sanctions, they focus a lot on money recently. Follow the money, figure out who's doing the transactions, penalize who's doing this and that. For trade compliance and export control, the focus is on goods. So you have to figure out where your goods are going and who your suppliers are as well, and figure out if there's license requirements. Can you export this thing to that specific person? Are they on any list? Are they owned by people who are on these export restriction lists, like the BIS list? And so there's a lot more nuance to that, specifically because goods are hard to classify. Especially for those who are not expert classifiers. Most corporations would have somebody in-house who looks at the goods that they are producing, manufacturing, selling, and says, okay, is this a dual-use good or not? But if you're just a bank analyst, it's really hard for you to figure out if this would be a dual-use good. You can take a best guess. You can ask your customers, do you deal with dual-use goods or not? But it is quite tricky to enforce from a layperson perspective. So I would say export controls are trickier, but it is the way it seems to be trending towards.
For the uninitiated, what is a dual-use good?
Dual-use goods are goods that can be used both by civilians and by the military.
Okay, and this is the microchips. I've read a lot about the microchip piece. I know it's not the only thing, but
yeah. So say for example, non-corrosive pipes.
Okay,
those can be used in a house, but it can also be used by the military because of its non-corrosive properties. So that's one thing that you could use. Or another would be a yogurt machine that turns powder to liquid or liquid to powder. That has biochemical weapon implications. So it could be a dual-use good.
Ted,
the widening of the aperture here is that with the way that generic components are used on the battlefield these days, these dual-use goods are increasingly general goods. So there have been a number of initiatives like the Common High Priority List, which is expanding the scope of these goods and products because, like I say, increasingly a generic component can be turned into a drone or a weapon. So that provides the tricky complexities is greater expanded sets of components, which mean more lists, which means keeping, again, that kind of whack-a-mole of what's coming down the pipe in terms of new lists and new types of products, new really specific components. And then the other layer of challenge that Hera alluded to is the banks that underwrite the trade finance transaction or the insurance company that provides cover. They're expected to get visibility into the underlying assets.
Okay.
And that's very tricky if they're dealing with arm's length or providing through intermediary services. So they're also exposed. Another lens into that export and dual use challenge from a sanctions perspective.
So if I'm a corporation and I'm selling non-corrosive pipes and that's my business, it's not that I can't sell what I sell just because it's dual use good, but I need to understand what the applications of my product could be. I need to understand who's buying it and what they're using it for. And then my bankers, insurers, my payment providers, that they all need to understand it as well.
They would ask questions about that as well.
Okay.
And it's not, you also need to know who it's going to.
Yep.
This is really tricky.
Yeah, very, very
the
much
end
so.
use, military end use is, another big terminology that we now hear. It's problematic because it's opaque and really understanding the end use. Where do you draw the line in terms of that value chain?
There is a really interesting development though, in that SWIFT, they have this specific MT payment. So they have specific fields that you are required in order to send money from one person to another through banks. So they're now talking about requiring a line for HS codes, which is the codes that are used to classify goods.
Okay.
So if that happens, then I think a lot of financial institutions would find it easier in some ways to implement export controls or trade compliance rules.
So you get automation in theory, or some automation, and for the companies that are being legitimate, that will work very well. And then it's, I guess, about identifying those that might try to circumvent it and put the wrong code in. Just to stick with the example, so if I'm my company selling the pipes and I'm selling them to Ted, and I've understood Ted, and I go, oh, Ted's fine, but Ted is intending to sell them to you, Hera, and for whatever reason you're somehow, persona non grata, we can't sell them to you. Is it my job to know that it's going from Ted to you, or is it once I've checked Ted, am I okay, and it's now Ted's job and his liability to check you?
It depends who you're talking to, but I would say there's a certain expectation on your end to make sure to verify who the end user is.
Okay.
And so if Ted signs some sort of contract that says, I am the end user, you can only do so much, right? Yeah. But if you have some sort of suspicion or reasonable, suspicion that Ted might not be the end user, then you're required to ask more questions.
Okay, so that word reasonable again.
And this is the context. So if I was operating in a third country very close to Russia and I was your immediate customer and my orders went 4x on a certain month, a certain time of a certain specific component, then you got, okay, what's happening? And where are your transit routes? What's happening with the extra volume? Where's it going? And this is where this whole the flow of the payment becomes the flow of the component. And do you really understand that? And have you asked questions? And who are you in terms of reputation, right?
Yeah.
Which is ultimately where the flow pack could come to.
So before I put that seller on President's Club, I need to ask some questions.
Do your due diligence.
Yeah. Risk-based approach.
Check your pipeline for your pipes business.
There you go. Nice. Like it. Sanctions evasion, you talked about some of the low-tech ways, etc. Like, are we seeing a lot of new tactics, or is it more what's old is new and it's the same things just done en masse? You mentioned whack-a-mole earlier, and actually when I was, chatting to one of the AI tools, I won't say which one, it mentioned this era of sanctions being the whack-a-mole era, which I thought was a nice terminology. So to give AI its due. Are we seeing much there?
I would say that there has been increased use of sanctions evasion techniques that have been in place. So say, for example, the use of shell companies are much more prevalent. Trying to obfuscate the actual owner or controller of the company is something that has been used historically, but it's exponentially used now because of the reach and the depth and breadth of sanctions. And so there's really is an expectation. This is something that has been emphasized by various regulators or government agencies. There's an expectation to figure out who you're doing business with. Are they shell companies? Are they ultimately owned or controlled by somebody on the sanctions list or somebody who has export restrictions against them, such as in the case of the BIS 50% rule?
Okay. It always reminds, I'm probably going to get this wrong, in cyber risk, right? That is it DDoS attack or something, but where they just overload a site. It's almost just the pure volume probably means that you can get some things through if somebody hasn't got the right automation, data, technology, because they can't check everything.
Exactly. Yes, it's really hard. That's why it's really helpful to utilize AI and technology to deal with, say, for example, the high volume of alerts that you get when you're screening against so many payments or so many number of customers and suppliers that you have.
Yeah, I think worth reflecting on a point you mentioned about the analog approaches, where actually the physical world that you operate in is still it's still something to think about. So the EU's 19th package designates the Russian shadow fleet. There's now 557 vessels, which to me isn't that shadow. Yeah. It's a significant portion of the entire fleet, and you've still got the ship-to-ship transfer of the LNG or the oil product going in. It's just the cost of enforcement. We've now started to see, seizure movement, but the movement of all that infrastructure to go and do that acquisition or run that kind of, it's just the cost and making sure you've got the right decisions and you've got the right data and you can stand by that politically and technically. So that's also still happening almost in plain sight, which, you can see the camera and the images on satellite.
Well, that's what I was about to say. I mean, I've probably watched too many movies. In my head, we can see all this from space and we can fly a drone over it, etc. A million things, probably someone can tell me why that's not exactly how it works, and there's all these implications, legal, technological, operational, but I would just think that this stuff happens because I expect it at this point, but it's a good point. Like we see in local policing, right, they have certain targets. They only have so many police. There's X amount of crimes. They, again, look for the high value stuff, and some of the lower stuff, unfortunately, maybe gets let go. I guess it would be the same principle, albeit played up at a geopolitical worldwide level.
Stakes.
Yeah, higher stakes. Thank you. It's the right phrase. You've mentioned a couple of the packages and some of the regulatory bits, but could we go a little bit deeper, Hera, just in terms of what's changed in that last 12 months? What are in these packages, and does it sort of differ by country and industry?
I would say there's a gradual escalation of sanctions, as we get into deeper and deeper or higher number of sanctions packages. So say, for example, in the latest package, or the package that was issued late last year, they sanctioned Rosneft, Gazprombank, and a number of other entities in that same value chain. And so there is a higher expectation, higher level of escalation of these sanctions rules. Another one is that the really interesting one I thought was the sanctioning of the 11 Russian special economic zones.
Okay. What are they?
So these are zones that have special rules, tax breaks, whatnot, around them. So say, for example, one is called the Technopolis. It's located in Moscow, and it is similar to the Silicon Valley of California. So they sanctioned that because a lot of issues are coming out of those specific special economic zones. And so a lot of corporations that are still doing business with Russia now have to figure out which of the customers they're doing business with are located in those special economic zones. And if they're located there, then they need to reevaluate how or what they're going to do about it.
Okay. And you mentioned the US and UK aligning on a couple of things. As you said, the EU, 27 member states, so sometimes it's hard to get the alignment. Are we seeing much divergence between US and EU, or is it generally coming together?
I would say the EU is much stronger in terms of going after Russia and issuing sanctions after sanctions after sanctions package against them. On the US side, it's been a little bit quieter on that front, but there was that recent energy sanctions against the largest energy companies in the world, which are Russian. And so there is still movement against Russia on the US side as well, but not to the same degree. However, if you look at the enforcement side, that's where the US is. You can really see there's been a lot of enforcement actions against companies and not even non-financial institutions that have violated Russian and other kinds of sanctions, like Iranian sanctions and whatnot. There's been a focus on entities such as property management, private equity firms, and other gatekeepers who are not banks.
Kind of putting everyone on notice, I suppose.
Exactly.
So when we talk about the US, we talk about the EU, we talk about the UK, obviously being based here in London. But for the rest of the world, I know some would align themselves with those various powers, and there's others that wouldn't, but they're not necessarily sided with Putin either. Like, how does this all affect those that maybe haven't picked a position?
Well, it's probably worth contextualizing. Again, we were talking before what sanctions are sort of designed ultimately to do in their conception, which is to initiate a behavioral change and be a temporary measure to enable that. So which side are you on of how do you kind of navigate this is really about your trade output, your posture, the geopolitical ties. So that's how institutions, both state-owned and state actors, think about these things. So I guess that kind of frame of thought is how you would say which how do you align, how do you think about it? So with the changing nature of trade and relationships, that's probably one of the ways to think about the BRIC countries, for example, or which allies, which relationships do you need? Again, you mentioned Davos, I think, in your introduction, but the 15 minutes of Mark Carney's speech talking about the middle powers and this new alignment model is kind of interesting as to where do you think these relationships, because you can use this quite tactically.
Yeah.
Okay. Or you can use this kind of as a strategic lever to manage relationships long term, and sanctions alongside things like tariffs are just part of those things to navigate between state actors. So yeah, that's quite a big picture, and it's quite a broad.
It's like the rule only means something if someone enforces it, right? Otherwise, you go, okay, well, thanks for telling me. You need to make sure people know there's a consequence to not following the rule. Otherwise, it may as well not exist.
And that's where your trade given the integrated nature of commerce, China in terms of the supply chain and components and where all those raw materials are coming from, critical earth, etc. And then obviously the US prevalence of technology and cloud. So again, you're starting to see how interwoven they are in corporates and trade, the way that the financial services market kind of runs on the dollar as a reserve currency. That's again a sort of a thematic to think about in terms of trade and sanctions.
I'm starting to suspect that we might not be able to break all of this down for every listener, given the complexity, but I'm sure you guys are available for anyone listening that wants to get deep into their specifics, because it just sounds like such a difficult job, particularly for those corporations. I mean, not to say the FIs don't have a difficult job, but to understand this and what it means for your business and the geopolitical impact and what you might want to do internationally versus not, what you want to do product line or not, what you want to do supply chain or not, just sounds like a really deep and collaborative ongoing piece of work.
But that's changed the nature of a compliance professional. So a lot of other research, with compliance professionals now, the opportunity is to become much more of an advisor in terms of forward planning, as opposed to meeting regulatory expectations, which are always rising, and you're always trying to build a defensible compliance program. But equally now, it's those advisory moments where you can think about, if we are going to launch X product in X market, what should we think about? Let's think about that, which as a compliance professional is really interesting because it opens up huge amounts of development and brings in these integrated themes, different types of risks, and enhances your practice.
Yeah. So, I mean, I remember we did a episode on sort of compliance officer of the future, and the guest talked about you need to have the soft skills. You can learn the regulation, or you can, maybe an AI bot will tell you the regulation in the future, but you need to be able to work with those other departments. And then, I mean, I think that you need a good level of understanding of technology and how it works. You might not need to be able to code, but you need to understand what is possible, what isn't possible with that. So you know what can be done automatically versus what needs to be slowed down and done with people or process. So yeah, interesting sort of links back to things we've discussed in the past and things I'm sure we'll discuss in the future as well. Enforcement, we've talked about. Hera, you mentioned, I think was it 14 or 17 enforcement actions in the US in 14, the past year, some in the UK. I'm sure there'll be some in the EU as well. Like, we can't cover all of them, obviously, in the time we have, but what have we seen in general? Like, are there specific things that people are being pulled up on, companies being pulled up on? And is that differing between the different areas that are issuing and enforcing these sanctions?
I think there's a couple of really interesting themes that I saw out of those different enforcement actions. One is the expectations, again, to figure out where your goods are going, who's touching them, who's using them, and things like that. So knowing your supply chain and who the end users are is critical. Another one is what I would say kind of back to basics in some cases is making sure that the technology you're using is doing what it's supposed to do. So say, for example, being able to make sure that the fuzzy logic within your screening system is able to catch spelling variations if it's something that is within the cultural norms of that specific kind of naming tradition.
Yeah, no, back to basics. It's kind of a theme that we've seen actually is in marketing and what people are most engaged in, like really trying to nail that down. But it's maybe when you're on the technologist side, it's almost surprising because you assume these things are a given, but obviously not when you think about the broad ecosystem that needs to get this stuff right.
Yeah, and making sure you do proper KYC, know your customer processes, do your due diligence, figure out what they're doing, who they're doing business with, and what goods are they supplying. I think those are really important things to get to know really well about your customers and suppliers.
Would you say the enforcement we're seeing is enough to drive the behavior change that Ted talked about? I mean, I know it's not our job to kind of pass judgment on the enforcement agencies and whatever, but I just wonder from the overview of we're seeing all this effort go in from private institutions, from regulatory bodies, from politicians trying to put this pressure on it. Is the sort of, has it got enough teeth, I guess, is the sort of way I'm thinking about it, that it's driving the change and driving the standard high enough?
I would say that from experience, say, for example, take OFAC and the historical fines against banks, the billions of dollars of fines, you can see that it really drives change. As a former, compliance person, I can go to the business and say, hey, this entity who does similar business operations to ours was fined X millions of dollars in fines. So we really need to our game. And those kinds of enforcement actions with big fines are a good leverage for compliance officers to go back internally and get buy-in for updating their screening systems, or just hiring more people to look at the alerts, or doing proper due diligence on their customers and suppliers. Yeah.
Ted, your perspective, again, like the macro view you're often so good at drawing all together. I wonder, do you think the enforcement is or will drive enough progress here?
Yeah, it's I guess the perennial. It's a challenge in Europe, I guess, with the way the EU's set up in terms of the enforcement capability, decentralized, the alignment. There is obviously the model of AMLA coming in AML, which is a centralized super authority based in Frankfurt. It's going to centralize enforcement and activity. So there is talk about the scope of that evolving to look at sanctions centrally. Might provide a bit more muscle to the EU as it starts to look closely. About 40 or so banks are going to be centrally supervised. That's one element. I think in the UK, we had a recent example. I think it's always tricky because it's always, you have a rules-based system where you need to have precision. And I go back to the point of sanctions meant to be a temporary measure. They're obviously political instruments. So you've got to think about that very carefully. So these step measures to do things like intervention on vessels, there's a lot to line up to make sure this lands well. This isn't a trivial effort to get these enforcement agencies to act in the way they're acting. So,
I'm probably being a very lazy backseat driver because I just sit here and ask questions, and I want to see stuff happen, but maybe I'm not given enough time to let things marinate and then come to fruition, perhaps. But
I think on the EU side, there is one thing that they could do to make it more impactful. A lot of EU countries don't publish their enforcement actions.
Okay.
And so it's really hard to get data on that. And it's really hard for entities operating in those countries to justify investing in their compliance programs.
Yeah.
If you don't have case studies or examples of who was fined and how much, then how are you supposed to get buy-in to enforce this?
What's the logic behind that? Do you know?
That's a good question. There's a lot of legalities around it. I suspect that GDPR plays a part, privacy rules. But other than that, it's really a black box. I'm not sure why they would not publish that when countries like the US, UK, and a lot of other European countries do.
Yeah. Well, if you're in one of those roles in the EU and you want to come on and explain, I'd love to have you on. Big ask. I'm sure they're all on the edge of their seats listening to this. Had a few audience questions, which I always enjoy, right? Because you get to sort of see what people are wondering if they're a regular listener. And one was just asking about sort of what you're doing with customers day to day. So it's kind of like, I guess that being present, I often ask you to look back over the last year or what's happened in the future. But right now, you guys work with customers and our teams day to day. Like, what are you problem solving with them on? Hera, maybe for start with you.
Let's see. Well, there's a lot of interest in using AI in the risk and compliance space, even in the sanction space. And so we're currently working on a number of things, such as using or leveraging AI to make the process of looking at alerts easier. There's also an appetite to leverage AI in detecting sanctions evasion. As to how we can make that work, of course, is something that takes a lot of thought and effort. But one other thing that has cropped up is because of the novel use of sanctions in the recent packages. There's now demand on the client side to come to us and say, hey, can you help us out with this specific this specific sentence that requires us to do X, Y, and Z. Okay. And so we need to be a little bit more agile in providing these services to them so that they can comply with the new regulations that are coming out. So take, for example, Article 5R or BIS 50 or the Russian special economic zones.
Okay. So we've kind of got doing what you do, but better using AI and more technology that's available. And then there are changes and expanding the scope or changing the scope in some cases. On the data side, Ted, I know you know data probably more than anyone I know, and you're named appropriately, as we always joke. It changes there as well from what you're seeing. And I know you've got a wider team that is working across this. So curious to your thoughts.
I'll build on Hera's. So there's sort of two things happening in kind of at the same time. One is AI's ability to curate and synthesize broad data sets into an opinion and a prediction and a kind of helping you run due diligence. That's across all different vectors, whether it's fraud, sanctions evasion, anti-bribery, corruption. what we're seeing equally is it's returning specific types of insights that themselves might merit further study with data and models. So example might be the financials of this company look a little bit suspect.
Okay.
So what we might want to do is make that a more skilled forensic accountant type approach, take that output and then put more rigor into that and say, is that a machine learning project? Was that a kind of a data discrepancy project? Let's look at that particular risk and feed that back in. So at the same time, you're having this kind of nice curation of overall risks, bringing things together for different lenses. And then we're seeing opportunities to create specific, like a shell company model or a address outlier model or something that might be industries that are for some reason just kind of inaccurate or discrepancy. So both those two things are really interesting and playing at the same time, because ultimately we need to be able to do due diligence safely, but quickly and at scale. And particularly the corporates that we've spoken to before, they're just not blessed with the team scale that you have in banks, but they've got larger third-party populations, more suppliers, and they're under increasing expectations. So that's happening at the moment, which is really an interesting time to be.
Feels like it's that curation of signals out of the data that's available is then aid in the best possible risk-based approach. You still end up needing the hardest things looked at by a trained professional, but you can triage it much better, it sounds like, if you get the right signals involved.
Yeah, and the outcome is a combination of the two. So it might be we need a fixed data approach or a rules engine for this particular part of my risk assessment. This piece, I'm interested in sort of curated view of possibilities because it's a broader type of research I'm thinking about. So if you can bring both those, it's different types of skills or different types of use of artificial intelligence or fixed models. I think that's really, there's a lot of opportunity there to help compliance professionals.
Yeah.
I agree. If I could build on that
Please.
as well, there's a shortage of competent or experienced sanctions professionals, and being able to leverage technology and AI to do a lot of the work or the footwork, so to speak, would be very helpful in addressing this shortage as well.
Okay. Yeah. I know, so much going on there, right? So you're busy. Again, if people want to go even deeper, I'd advise reaching out, and we'll link both your profiles in the show notes. One of the things I wanted to ask was, like, because there are these changes that are sort of, as you said, incremental, and sometimes they're a little bit more, sometimes they're bigger leaps. Is there a way that organizations can best prepare for when they don't know what they're preparing for? Are there like fundamentals to just get in place now? I know it's quite a vague question, but any ideas? You're nodding, Ted. Have you got something to your tongue?
I guess it's sort of, I suppose the idea was you're thinking about scenario assessment, the what if analysis, what happens if this happens, or understanding. I mean, I guess there's some baseline foundational compliance work that you'd think has been happening in the background, but then I suppose it's looking forward. But yeah, I guess, smiling because there's so many different things to be thinking about. So I would say back to basics is a good idea, really understanding your business. So yes, we can get external information, we can get prompts and research, but really understanding the organization that you work for. What are the products? What are the goods? What are the customers? What are the different risk profiles? That's absolutely imperative. So you can be more advisory and forward looking. So I'd say that's, it's a really start of the year. It's a really good time to make sure as a compliance professional, you really network that understanding in your organization and outwardly who you're trading with, what your products and services actually doing.
Because as you were talking about all the signals, where my mind was sort of going back to is episode we did last year with Ian Godfrey, also in the IPR team, around master data management, data interoperability. And like, if you master that data, then all of your data, you mentioned the supply chain, the value chain, your supply parties. If you've mastered that and you've got it set up right, in theory, you can then add those signals much more easily and deploy to changes quickly. So that's where my mind went. But as you say, you need to know what to do. So you also need that scenario plan in the compliance advisor role to then go, right, the data's in a good place, therefore we can do this thing if we've got the right vendors, partners, expertise to deploy it.
I would say that that's really critical if you're trying to have a good change management or crisis management process in place, which is something that you should have in place if you want to do proper scenario planning or horizon scanning. So if you want, say, for example, to figure out, how many of my customers are exposed to country X, and because it's popping a lot in the news and it might be sanctioned, who knows, or there might be restrictions around it. So if you have a good MDM or master data management in place, you can pull out those data and see what the risk is to your business if that happens.
Yeah. Good. So I think always trying to make it practical, right, is the thing, because then people can go, right, am I doing that in my org? Last question actually from audience member, and then we'll go to just recommended resources. But you talked about it a couple of times, said about these are supposed to be temporary measures that affect behavior. And when the behavior changes, at some point you don't need them. And somebody asked, like, there's negotiations or meetings going on between the Ukraine, Russia, the US trying to sort of mediate and lead it. Obviously, EU's got a role as well. If these are successful and peace is achieved in a way that, well, from my perspective, that Ukraine is happy with or is willing to go for, do the sanctions go away, or do we expect them to remain in place for a period of time? Like, is there a precedent? I'm a little bit blind on that.
There is precedence to the lifting of sanctions in the case of, let's see, Syria, Sudan, Myanmar, and whatnot. In the case of Iran, it was lifted and put back again. So there is precedence in the lifting of sanctions, and that is something that can be done. However, I would say from a more practical perspective, compliance professionals are a little more careful around lifting or changing their internal processes and procedures around these kinds of changes, because you never know what's going to happen. Maybe they'll reimpose sanctions on Iran again, and then you're stuck doing business with somebody who you're not supposed to from a contractual perspective or something like that. And so really something like that needs to be thought out quite carefully.
Okay.
Add to that. I mean, also, if you think about what's happened, some of these multinationals have exited the country, right? So they've pulled out of people, capital investment, infrastructure assets. Again, it's not quite as easy as just turning the taps back on. So that could be another 2 or 3 years of ramp up to go and get production back going in Russia, or set up a distribution for your pharmaceutical business. So you'll be thinking long and hard about that, just practically as a business professional, as well as, if the provisions got snapped back, what kind of controls are in place? How quickly might the sanctions come back? So I think that uncertainty is still going to be the kind of operating model, and act with caution, and then trying to think about how quickly you could withdraw if need be, or, if you're going to go back into those markets, what kind of controls and mitigations, and have you got adequate due diligence and systems in place?
Exactly. And it might not only be sanctions risks that are there. There could be money laundering risks, corruption risks, and tax evasion risks and whatnot. So it's not only sanctions that compliance professionals need to think about. There's a whole gamut of other issues that are in place.
Well, as I said a few moments ago, the complexity here and the amount of rabbit holes we can or perhaps should go down in specific episodes is quite extensive. But if people want to talk about one of these, or they're facing a problem in their business, I know they can reach out to eReview. We got a whole team, right, Ted, in your role. So we'll link to your profiles in the show notes. Hera, is there any content that we've put out recently that you'd point people to as well if they want to learn more, or anything else that not Moody's that you point them to sort of keep educating themselves?
Well, let's see. I would say that there is a really interesting data story that we put out recently on the BIS 50% rule, which talks about export control, but there are also sanctioned individuals that are affected there. So the data story is really interesting. I can send the links to you. But another resource would be the global sanctions mapping that we've done. It shows you the number of countries that have their own autonomous sanctions, which I think highlights the kind of fragmented deglobalization of sanctions to some effect.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put those links in, and if people have got questions, then obviously reach out to Hera. But thank you both for making time. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we don't have to have you back next year to talk about the 5th year this war, but no doubt we probably will need to speak about sanctions in 27 as well. So until then, thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.